Nice. All right. Well, thank you, ladies, so much for joining us. I'm really excited about this topic because it's probably the one that I've had the most questions about from people. Because I think since NFTs and digital art are kind of new, a lot of people don't necessarily think about museums and the museum space with them. Everyone's a little bit focused on the sort of flashy news about them right now in terms of auction houses and galleries and collecting online. They kind of forget that all of this is going to need to be documented, in fact, by museums. That's sort of the role of museums. So now how does that all play out? So I'm so happy to have you guys with us and discuss this. And I'll take it to Bernadine first. Tell us who you are, what you do, and then we'll do a little introduction of Francis, and we'll dive into the topic.
Thank you so much for having me, Natasha and Kadaf, and I'm really delighted to be here today with Francis as well. So I'm Bernadine Bröcker. I'm the CEO of a company called Vastari. We've been developing tools for the museum industry, specifically for exhibitions. So we operate one database that is private collections available for loan to museum exhibitions, and a second database of touring exhibitions that are available for new venues to host. And of course, during 2020, all exhibitions were closed. Museums came across a really difficult time in terms of cash flow, and realized, I think there was a change post-pandemic where museums are really thinking about digital strategies from all angles, not just about a marketing strategy or an engagement strategy, but actually how do you digitize museums? And so we developed something called Vastari Labs, where we've been talking to museums about digital innovation and about how to use digital technologies to improve exhibitions and experiences and all of this. And as a result of that, we've been talking a lot about NFTs. We already were talking about blockchain. Back in 2018, we organized a conference with Christie's about blockchain and art to try and raise awareness about the potential of blockchain in the industry. And so seeing it now come further is really exciting.
Fabulous, fabulous. Yeah. Francis, tell us about you.
Hey, yeah, I'm Frances Liddell. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester, and I've been working collaboratively with the National Museums Liverpool, based in Liverpool, UK, to basically explore how we can use blockchain in museums, and specifically NFTs, essentially in a community engagement context, which kind of has involved looking at how we can use NFTs to potentially forge relations between kind of a museum and the audiences it serves. And I'm really interested in looking at kind of how we can use NFTs beyond the monetary value, and how can museums engage with them to answer questions that they've been looking at in terms of their practices and approaches to both audiences and their collections. And yeah, I'm kind of really trying to promote kind of looking at it, not just as a fundraising aspect, which is really important, but I think there's so much more that museums can do with NFTs, and this kind of concept of digital thingness. So yeah, that's kind of the things I've been looking at.
Nice. So exciting. I'm so glad that there's an area of study around this now as well. That's pretty fabulous. I don't think everyone realizes that. It's
yeah,
great.
I think I'm the only one.
You're trailblazing. You're starting the trend. I love it.
Yeah.
So Bernadine, tell us more about how you see the role of museum, and maybe even a little bit, how you see it sort of happening now, and where you see, there's room for growth and change, and what you think should be the future.
Well, I think looking more from a zoomed out perspective at blockchain and decentralization in general, I think there's really a lot of potential when you look at documentation and the relationship between the private sector and museums. And private sector includes private collectors who lend art, but also audiences and suppliers. There is this a difficulty in digital strategies when you're talking about a nonprofit organization working with external providers or stakeholders, because you kind of want to protect that data and you want to figure out how that's going to work. And so what I found inspiring at first was the fact that with blockchain, you can create collaborative ways of working where you don't have anyone specifically owning the data. You can have the information shared. And as a result, we could potentially create efficiencies within the industry. And specifically where I was looking originally was at a part where I'm very involved, which is loan agreements, insurance, and shipping, because you have pieces of paper that are being shared that it's not well documented. There are no APIs. It's really inefficient. So could we potentially look at blockchain for that? And I think people often think about NFTs in the framework now of artworks, but NFTs are tokens that can be used for any unique digital asset. So that unique digital asset could be a loan agreement, it could be an insurance document. And that's where I sort of got quite inspired. But then what's been really interesting with this boom in the NFTs and what's happened over the last few months is that there's this concept of digital scarcity. And I think that when we look at museums and their policies on openness and kind of sharing all of their data and educating, that's really interesting. But then you kind of have people sometimes, there's so much information that people don't necessarily feel ownership of it and a connection to it. So the concept that potentially we could create this digital scarcity and make people have a connection with all the stuff that museums are relating with, I think that's really interesting. And Frances, I mean, you've been working on that a lot, aren't you?
Yeah, that's pretty much kind of my idea, really. And because I think this is the thing, is that we look at digital collections and digital objects, and they have so much potential because we can start adding new layers of meaning to them without changing the physical object itself. Often in galleries, we see just one kind of narrative being told. So how can we use digital objects and how can we use this digital scarcity to create new narratives and new kind of interpretations and open up collections, but also give someone a way of kind of owning that narrative as well? And I talk about my research and the kind of NFTs that we made with the museum as kind of basically personal editions. They're kind of extensions of the collection, but they're kind of really intimately personal, which is why I say like they're probably unlikely to be traded, because it's like having this deep emotional connection to an object.
Oh, I think that's wonderful though, because I think a lot of the questions I get very often is this something where the whole point is just that it's traded art? And what I really want to open people up to, especially to maybe some sort of more old school collectors who are a little terrified by what's happening right now, is that there are really personal works happening. And so that's not something that's intended to be traded right now. And that's probably a really good thing. It's probably something that, you know, in 15, 20 years, 30 years is going to be something that's seen at the same way that we look at, you know, an impressionist work that was, received by the patron by a particular artist friend. And so not something that he bought with the intention that it's going to be selling for whatever amount in his lifetime. So it creates that same type of what I think the art world likes to refer to as authentic art experience, relationship just for the love of art with the work. So that's wonderful. I wish we could talk about that a bit more, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll share my screen and I'll show you guys what we've been doing.
Great.
So essentially, we co-created an online exhibition called Crypto Connections with a group of participants with the really kind of simple idea of exploring the personal. So how do we relate to objects, both to kind of personal possessions, but also to museum objects as well? And as you can see, we basically have two sets of objects in this online exhibition: personal possessions, which the participants brought in on the first workshop. And we also got them to choose one object as well from the NML collections of National Museums Liverpool. And essentially, we just got them to kind of write a kind of personal interpretation of the object. So why is it personal to them? What's their relationship to it? Why did they choose it? And as you can see, basically there's a simple idea of the image with that summary next to it.
Beautiful.
And the kind of main motivation for this was then we used this information to create NFTs. So they're quite simple. This is, bear with me, this is sort of 2019, 2020, when, there was only the option was kind of Ethereum, and we were just kind of experimenting. But essentially, we created this third digital space called the Possession Gallery, which is connected to the Ethereum blockchain via a smart contract. And basically we created NFTs of each object from the exhibition and gave these out to the participants. So the participants completely own their tokens. The museum can't do anything about them. So the department could sell them if they wanted to, but we kind of take that argument that because of the personal connection, they're very unlikely to. And we were kind of looking at this idea of like, does this create new connections? Does this bring people together and make them feel a sense of belonging to a museum? Whilst also giving them kind of something like an output of the whole process itself. Because we talk a lot about how collaborations and co-production in museums is kind of meaning making, and the meaning comes from the process. Well, the NFT can then be an output of that. So they can walk away, not just with that memory and experience, but also some form of tangible kind of thing that they can own. The main idea.
I think that's exactly it. People often think the NFT is the object itself, but it's actually the frame around the object with the metadata that kind of tells you at that specific time and place what was important. And I kind of like to compare that to an exhibition where you're reframing the object within a context that changes its story, right? And so you can timestamp that changed context, and you then own that token of that timestamp. And that what Frances did is just really exciting, because it just opens up this concept of owning your memories with these objects and this emotional connection. And yeah, would you want to sell that, or do you want to actually preserve that within your own personal wallet and hold on to it for a long time?
Yeah, absolutely. What a wonderful way to put it. I think that's really going to help people to have a better mental image for what the NFT represents, because sometimes NFT can definitely feel a bit just like an acronym and a bit confusing for people, even when they understand what it means technically. It's still hard for them to understand what it means in an art context.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we're thinking about museums and how they approach NFTs as well, it's so important that they think about what makes their NFTs different from just crypto art.
Yes.
It is ultimately the question of interpretation and associations, because that's what makes a museum artifact an artifact and not just a commodity to be sold in the art market. And I think if we can open that up to kind of audiences and communities and people that perhaps have deep, meaningful connections to the objects, we can also then start learning through these NFTs as well. So, I think it opens up a whole new investigation for museum practices.
Yeah, and one of the research projects we're working on at the moment is with the Whitworth in Manchester, and Frances knows the Whitworth really well. And they have been exploring, and it will be live soon, how they can issue NFTs that help raise funds for the communities around the museum with a collection item. So basically creating NFTs that give the artwork new life, that actually literally brings money back to the community. So that's a completely new and innovative way of looking at it. And it's definitely something that might ruffle some feathers of thinking like, is this really what you should be doing with a museum object? But that's definitely the questions. Those are the questions they want to ask, because they feel that the museum does have a social purpose, right? And society has produced them to support society. So we should ask questions about the economics that drive the museums and the value that we attribute to the objects that are in their collections.
Absolutely, absolutely. And do you guys, does either of you have a little bit more to say about, how currently museums are looking at, everyone's asking, are museums thinking about having departments now that are specialized in digital art and NFT? Are they looking to hire at least one person who specializes in this? What is your take or your experience so far in your museum relationships about how they're looking at the digital NFT world?
Most museums that have contemporary focus have a digital art curator. This is not new, and there are some really sophisticated conversations about the digital art going on within museum departments and thinking about it. So Frances, I don't know if you also found the same.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of people kind of thinking, okay, this is clearly something like what is this? Like, how can it help us? But at the same time, museums are so risk averse. There's this slight sense of, there's so much kind of ethical questions around this. The things that I've been looking at in my own research, but I think in a way, my research kind of, because the National Museum of Liverpool obviously were helping from the start, they're a collaborative partner. But time, I sometimes think I don't think they quite realised what they were letting themselves in for. And I think particularly at the start of this year when everything kind of blew up, they were like, oh, we've already been doing this. And then it was kind of a real kind of thing of like, okay, well then how do we promote this and how do we make sure we don't get any negative associations? And I think these are the questions a lot of museums are asking as well. It's like, are they ready for something that's actually just incredibly risky? Because of the decentralization on, and the kind of lack of control over NFTs. Yeah.
Well, that's
and I mean, it's also radical transparency, because if a museum is going to own an NFT, then they have a wallet. And that means that it's transparent. People can see what's in their wallet. And even though museums are open and they do have their collections open for everyone to see, I don't think it's quite that open. So this is definitely a next level. And one of the things that we were, for example, looking at with the Whitworth is, if they have a wallet, how do we handle that kind of documenting of what happens within that wallet, and that they can then preserve that for future, right? And that they can have even that kind of documentation of that process as something that will be in the museum collection. I think that's another really interesting thing.
Wonderful. So another question that everybody has been hitting me with is sort of preservation, and how we see the sort of long-term preservation of, obviously we already have that consideration within the art world in terms of like video art and digital art in that sense, but how do we see it in the sort of new digital art NFT space? And do you guys have any experience or thoughts in that?
I think preservation is a really interesting one, because I think we automatically assume because NFTs are in some way permanent that therefore they automatically preserve. Which in the case, they preserve the information about that artwork. For example, because we use the URL link from the online exhibition for our works and our NFTs, if that server goes down, those NFTs are kind of broken. And one of the issues with URL links, and of course you can use in IPFS systems, which kind of have another kind of layer of protection, so to speak, because they're decentralized. But it is a kind of interesting one, and I suppose it depends ultimately on what you think the value is. Do you value having that information about that exchange? For example, in my project, that's perhaps the most important part, because it's that moment of the museum relinquishing control and handing that NFT over to that participant, that is really the value in the project in itself. Because if you are buying digital artwork, you probably think the value is actually in the aesthetics of the thing itself, in which case, how do you go about preserving that? And I think that's something that still people are grappling with this in the sector.
Completely. And I think that there is also on the archiving side of things, you mentioned IPFS, and there's another one called Arweave that also is kind of trying to preserve what they're calling the permaweb. But those services still have risks of the assets being lost, if you will. And I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is the sustainability of these types of systems, and how museums interact with the environmental impacts of these systems. And I think that there might be a potential for museums to get involved in that conversation about the permaweb, and because they are permanent institutions, and they are institutions that are thinking about the long term. So they are the perfect partners for organizations like Arweave and IPFS to be thinking about how these things can be stored for the long term. And I mean, if they get into the conversation and can also talk to them about sustainability and all of the ESG issues that museums are very passionate about, they can steer the conversation within these tech circles towards a different direction. So I think for that to happen, you need a lot more education and a lot more of the tech people within museums to get inspired by this. So that's a big part of it.
Fabulous. Yeah, it occurs to me that, I mean, my next question is going to be about sort of environmental impact, and the fact that just about as soon as the hype of NFT really started to take hold, we also had the sudden realization that they are hugely environmental impactful, in fact, and probably in a very negative way most of the time. And so we have some new things coming up where we've got green NFTs coming up, and thoughts about how to do that in a more environmentally sustainable way, as well as it being, as you said, something that's permanent. So your orders have touched upon it, but I'm sure that you guys have thoughts about the museums being the arbiters of that, much like sort of microfiche was, I suppose, of days gone by in the library system. Yeah.
One museum contact that I know that recently emailed me a file, but actually linked to it and didn't attach it to the email. And she was saying, I'm trying to think about my green footprint and not attaching files to every single email. And that was it, regardless of blockchain, right? That was just about thinking about the sustainability of attaching files to every email and having so many copies. And I think that the conversation needs to evolve beyond just talking about the impact of decentralization on the environment, because I think that is definitely one part of it. But I think we should also talk about the impact of just having so many copies of the same thing, and that's impact on the environment. If we can use digital scarcity to actually decrease our usage of the internet, that could be really powerful again. But the conversation hasn't evolved quite yet. We've just been talking about how there are all these computers mining, but not about how we interact with those computers.
Yes. Oh, fabulous. Oh, I'm already seeing like a fabulous convention that you're going to plan for museums to have this wonderful, much needed conversation around the whole concept of scarcity and how that plays a role within environmental impact in the internet. I think it's something that in the art world, we probably have never really thought about before. I don't think I know of anyone really, and it's a great story, because I don't think I know of anyone in the art world that would think about the amount of attachments. And I mean, my gallery friends, capable of sending a lot of attachments. It's such a sales sort of method right now that, I don't think that anyone's really thinking about that. That's a really good point. I really love that. So moving on a little bit, what do you guys think is in store? Do you think that there are going to be some, are you pushing for, do you want there to be some more exhibitions that are purely or include, sort of like what you're doing, Frances, of including the NFT element into the physical exhibition? Because a lot of people, of course, also have a little bit of fear that this is all going to replace in-person museum visits, which of course, I think all three of us know is not the case. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about that so that people hear it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because I did because originally as part of my research, I wanted to kind of put these NFTs back in the physical gallery space, how people would respond to them, and think about basically the authenticity of it. Like if you put an NFT in a physical gallery space with, like, say, the block number underneath, will this change how people view the NFT? Will they no longer see it as a duplicate and see it as an entity in its own right? This could be a really interesting experiment. I think there are a few galleries. I know there's one in New York now kind of doing the NFT museum. I think, as you say, it doesn't have to be either or. I think this could be really interesting kind of entwinement of NFTs and physical works and digital works, all kind of working in that kind of gallery space. And starting to, I think it will help people to start kind of recognizing the value in digital art as well, because I feel like so often with digital art, unless you put a frame around it, people don't value it. People don't see it the same, because so often it's just kind of on a projector, or, it's not presented in a way that perhaps we expect art to be. Only with the NFT, you add this kind of dimension of kind of authenticity. It's like, well, does that then start people kind of changing the narrative of digital art in itself? And is there a future in it? So I think that's the thing I'd love to kind of push as well and kind of explore further.
I completely agree. I think that I do know there are some exhibitions that are including NFTs. I mean, of course, there was the virtual niche exhibition in Beijing at UCCA that it was in the project space of UCCA, and they had digital art as well as NFTs on display. And it was a really successful example of integrating NFTs. What I think is interesting is the metadata in NFTs, specifically for crypto art, doesn't necessarily include the artist's vision of how that art should be interacted with. And that is something that I know artists who would never want their artwork to be shown in a white-walled virtual reality gallery. They think that is like killing it. But the physical artists have actually developed ways of documenting their art to say, I want it to be displayed in this way, and this is how it goes, etc. When it comes to crypto art, the metadata within the smart contracts doesn't yet say, I would rather that you show this within a digital frame, or I would rather that you show this through image projection, or whatever it might be. And I think that that is the next generation as well, is kind of thinking about, how do you want people to live with your art or exhibit it? Do you have a preference, or do you not care? And I like what Frances said about it changes people's perception of digital art, and they kind of start valuing it more, because I do think that digital artists, specifically the ones who are doing so well in this space, are the ones who have had to do commission work and freelance work because their digital art wasn't seen in the same light as painters and sculptors, etc. And now we can finally appreciate the craft of the digital art and put it on the same type of pedestal that we put the craft of physical art. I think that's going to be really exciting going forward.
Fabulous, fabulous. I think that makes me very excited for the type of museum exhibitions as well as gallery exhibitions that could come up. Yeah, marrying the three, as it were, as much as possible in a really interesting way. So now, how do you guys look at, well, I don't know if you have any thoughts about, you know, collecting and wading into the collecting, because I think I also had a number of people ask me, what did I know about museums collecting NFT and digital art, and in terms of, you know, a wider context of their collection. So do we see that there are just, let's say, the more modern contemporary museums that are going for this? Or do we, you know, are we trying to, just us in the community, encourage the more antiquity museums to get in there as well? You must obviously have an opinion on this, Frances, I can tell, but please go for it and tell us what you think about it.
There's an example, right, Frances?
Exactly.
Well, actually, the thing is, the museum technically doesn't own the NFTs. So, you know, but I do think it's an interesting one. I think it will happen in the same way that everything happens in museums. It's a bit serendipitous, you know, oh, we've got given an NFT. I think that's probably the way it will begin, like gifting and donations, because it'll force them to think about, okay, how do we store this? How do we use a digital wallet? How do we use multi-sig? All these kind of questions that, you know, will be incredibly important if they are really like sort of seriously thinking about kind of storing and presenting NFTs. I really hope they do, though. I think this is, like, again, kind of the next step into museums kind of really kind of looking at the NFT space as something that it's worthwhile putting their resources into. I'm sure Bernadine probably has some examples.
I was just thinking, when Natasha said about the antiquity museums, I was thinking of the Uffizi example, about what they just did. I don't know if we can call it an NFT. It's called a DAW, a digital artwork. They're trying to have a different acronym for it, right. But it is in essence the same concept. And I think that museums need to think about whether that's what they want to happen to their collections. So if I look at what the Uffizi did, I would probably call that digital deaccession, where they took the digital JPEG of one of their works, and the Galleria de Venezia is doing the same thing, taking digital versions of their works and selling those as NFTs. But it's almost like deaccessioning the digital version of the work. And I think that might be short-termism. I think there might be a little bit of, there are some things that are not going to be possible as a result of doing that. And I don't think the museums have been advised to think thoroughly through what their options were. Because of course, deaccession is on the table for a lot of museums at the moment because of the financial struggles, but there are more, I think, more strategic ways you could potentially use NFT technology and the blockchain to raise funds for the museum without having to resort to deaccession. I don't know, Frances, what you think?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because I think what the Uffizi did is it kind of the direct issue of the dilemma of commodification of culture, which of course we all skirt around in our projects, but at least I think I know with the kind of changing, you know, it's a kind of new dynamic artwork that they've created. It's something that, you know, has originality. in the same way that mine, again, we're changing the metadata, they become something different. And we're not also, bear in mind, my project was not kind of talking about copyright or anything like that. We said from the start to the participants, you get like this ownership over this token, but you have no, like, this does not mean you have any law binding ownership over the physical work. I think if you're just selling a JPEG of a physical work, you start getting into those difficult conversations about what does it really mean to own something? And it is kind of that thing of then why do you own just a JPEG? Like, particularly of all the kind of happenings at the moment with open access in museums, it really kind of goes against the grain of this kind of promoting of opening up collections. If you just start selling digital images that have no real kind of meaning or kind of difference, I suppose, is kind of.
Yeah, and the copyright issue kind of touches on that, right? Because there is this, I was talking to Cynthia Gainton, who's like a lawyer in thinking a lot about NFTs, and she was describing how if you have a change of use, so for example, if you print an image on a mug, you're changing the use of the image, and then that's considered different to having a digital image of the work on a website. And I think that selling a JPEG kind of is very difficult to kind of define if that's merchandise or if that is actually the original and how that works in copyright terms. So I think we can be a bit more inventive about what a digital souvenir from a museum can be. And that that's not what I've seen from the Uffizi and Galleria de Venezia example, but maybe you can get them to talk at some point about why they did this, and then they can explain a bit more.
Well, that being said, another sort of interesting point that I've been hearing in a lot of different panels that I've been doing now is people asking sort of, have you, because of COVID-19, sort of being the catalyst, let's say, for this like boom and craze of NFT and digital art, and also digital representation of the museum space online, or the art fair experience online as we're doing now, have you found that you've sort of accidentally fallen into a advisor role in any way, either one of you? Because I found that really fascinating that right now, there's lots of people who didn't think of themselves ever to be advisors, also, you know, friends who run companies that weren't in any way known for advising, suddenly having to do advising because they just were a little bit more in the digital space, and everyone went to them and said, well, you know computers, or you know websites, you know visual, tell me, what do I do?
We're a prime example of that, to be honest. And we've really struggled to figure out how we handle that, because also we're in an industry where expertise is undervalued. People expect to have a coffee for free and drain your brain of all the information that you have, and they don't pay for it. Whereas in other industries, you would be paid for an hour of your time and your knowledge. So I think that's it's a very difficult subject. And I think there's this expectation like, oh, tell me what you want and there will be a payoff for you in the long term, or there's exposure for you, or all this type of thing. But I don't think that's fair. So I do think we need to talk about that. And there are many people thinking about this. Yeah, Frances, have you found the same?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been mad, sort of the amount of people that have contacted me on LinkedIn. You know, apparently I'm one of the first people that come up when you look up NFTs and museums, which is great. Suddenly having bombarded with these people. I mean, it's been great. It's been amazing. And it's been a way of meeting people in this sector. And of course, I'm coming into my third year of my PhD. I'm kind of winding down to the end, looking at kind of what do I want to do in this space. So this has worked amazingly well for me, because consultancy, of course, is a kind of very common thing for academics to do. And I love, you know, sharing my research and help the sector kind of build itself up. But yeah, at the same time, it's sort of that thing of like, do I give my time for free? Like, I know I'm getting paid for the PhD, but I'm not getting paid to do this. And then suddenly you have to think more about how much information you are giving away, which I feel really uncomfortable. And it's also, I found this kind of, particularly with this boom, is kind of having to promote myself and promote my research, which again, I'm so new to it, and it feels really, really weird. But yeah, I guess it's just one of those things now. It's something like, okay, well, I'm one of those few people that are working in this space. I need to build out that portfolio, and I need to also help others kind of do the projects and build the projects around me as well. So, you know, I can kind of promote my research further. But yeah, it's a difficult one with the kind of concept of payment as well, because so often everyone's kind of a startup, and it's passion projects.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know how you navigate that really.
I think that this is a wider conversation about how much, because you want the expertise to be in the industry to be able to make sure that projects are better, right? Like what we were talking about earlier, did the Uffizi talk to other people to get a perspective on what they were going to do and whether that was a wise decision? Maybe not. And if they're cash strapped, then would they want to pay for that expertise? Probably not. But then we also need to support those who know this. So for example, Frances, she needs to be supported to stay in this industry and financially be remunerated for that knowledge. Otherwise, we're going to lose her to Google or Facebook or wherever she decides to end up working. I don't know where you want to go, Frances, but I mean, the industry has a brain drain going on at the moment, and we need to incentivize them to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, it's really fascinating to hear both of your points of view, because I also wanted to touch a little bit upon the fact that, you know, everyone watching this is going to see that we're three women, and, you know, this is not always common. And a lot of, you know, questions have come up about the role of women in digital art NFTs. It's been a really amazing moment. My experience has been, there have been a lot of women in the sphere already from pre-COVID. But it's interesting because there are quite a bit. Actually, Bernadine, I think you wonderfully pointed out to someone when they were sharing their LinkedIn panel that was all men, and I could have liked your comment 500 times over if I had the ability to. When you said, you know, there's some women in this sphere, you might want to add to your panel. So yes, how has been your experience so far being a woman and being, you know, now considered experts? I mean, obviously part of it is difficult because they want your expertise for free, but also, do you find that, you know, you're rarely sometimes, you know, considered like expert in the NFT digital field? Is that considered somewhat strange still because you're a woman, or do you find like times are moving forward with that in your experience? Go ahead, Frances.
Yeah, it's been a strange one. I think it reminds me of back when I first kind of started getting interested in blockchain, and I attended the Blockchain Manchester groups, which were great. And, you know, it was, you know, incredibly supportive. And I don't want to say in any way that they were intimidating, but it wasn't very intimidating walking in, looking around. I was like, I'm pretty much the only woman here.
Yeah, yeah.
That thing of also the felt of like, I don't really know very much about blockchain, but actually you kind of get past that immediately. I also feel like I've got a bit of an age thing as well, because I kind of came straight from my master's and undergrad. So I'm already feeling a little bit like imposter syndrome of being a PhD student and then adding that kind of women element. But, you know, I found places like, I mean, I want to big up the Bigger Pie and like Women of Blockchain Talks networks, because they've been great. And it makes you realize that there are a lot of women in this space. You say they just don't necessarily get promoted on the big blockchain conferences that you first start going to, you know, when you start learning about this space. You kind of look around, you're like, there's a lot of men in suits, like where's all the women? Yeah. So yeah, it's been a kind of interesting one, and I think it's just something that perhaps I'm kind of growing into that space now. I'm kind of growing into my expertise, which I think is something that happens doing a PhD anyway, regardless of your gender. But yeah, I don't know. Bernadine's been in this space for much longer than I.
No, I mean, Natasha, you and I know each other for a long time now in this art and tech space, and I've actually found that if I see a company that has a woman in the prominent position within the company, it's likely to be less BS. As in, especially in blockchain, where you're constantly trying to weed through the kind of crypto BS and get to the reality of the situation. Yes. I think women have less time for wasting time on speculative projects that are not going to actually go anywhere. Maybe, yeah. I don't know, this is a theory, yeah. But I think that if you can see that there is a woman on the team, it probably is something that's a little bit more credible, which is really funny. Maybe that's my bias here, but I feel like there is a lot of...
You're not the only one who thinks it.
No, but I think there is, or at least diversity, right? Like if it's not just the bro culture type of thing, then you do, it can sometimes feel a little bit more real. And I think that we're talking about the metaverse. It is very abstract. It is very like meta, but we can, it is grounded. There is a truth to what's happening here, and there is some real an evolution of knowledge that is happening in a digital sense. And I think that if you want to get a bit deeper, sometimes look out for the women that might be able to tell you something without the aggrandizement and the pomp of some of the other people speaking in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd have to agree. I'm sure no one will be shocked that the women agree that if a woman is a part of it, it's better. But
no, but it's diversity, right? It's like we're the crypto bubble. People constantly talk about that. And I mean, I had an in real life meetup with some people from the crypto space this week. And we went to a gallery, and we walked around, and there was a contemporary art gallerist who said, oh, you're involved with digital art. I love digital art, as long as you're not involved with this NF something, right? And you kind of start laughing, because we were with like two very big influencers in the crypto space in this gallery. And I was just thinking, gosh, we're outside of the crypto bubble. We're remembering what the real world is thinking about this. And I think that that's the next step, is kind of moving from this bubble to expanding it to further people. And that will take some translation, some diversity of views, some more thinking than just being within that space.
Yeah. I totally agree there. It's like, it's one of those things, it's so easy to forget that we're in such an echo chamber of like NFTs. Oh, these are interesting. Like, what are these? Was like, for example, when I taught, I've been teaching digital heritage this semester, and it's a master's program. And one of the weeks I did blockchain, and you know, no one knew what it was. And you're like, this is digital heritage master's course. So let's just take a step back and think like, actually, yes, though. It's probably because everyone on Twitter that I follow are also in the crypto space, that actually it's really exciting. And yes, it appeared on BBC and ITV, but did anyone actually watch it? Or did anyone actually understand it? Did it take in? And I think, as Bernadine kind of rightly points out, it's this is the next step. It's to bridge that gap, because a lot of museum audiences do not know about crypto and don't care about it. So how do we make them care? And that's the kind of key question, I think.
Yeah, it really makes me think about this recent auction at Christie's with the Warhols and the NFT Warhols. And that was the first time, realizing it was the first time that many of the people that I work with had ever heard really of NFTs or what any of this was. And, you know, contacted me just because, what is this? Oh, it's being sold at Christie's. And so now it must be a real thing, you know, because Christie's. And I sort of, wow, okay, this has not been on your radar at all, and Christie's is bringing it mainstream for you. So yeah, I'm wondering what you guys think about.
There was a lot of critique of that that sale, actually, because Warhol produced these digital images in a specific resolution, and they were upscaled to a higher resolution for the sale today, because the people at Christie's and the Andy Warhol Foundation believed that they were more sellable if they were a higher resolution. But that's not really the authentic digital work that Andy Warhol created. So if you are a digital purist, you're looking at this thinking, Andy Warhol didn't have screens that size when he was working. So this is not something that has that aura of the original, in Walter Benjamin's words, of like the pixelation of that time. And so you're actually selling a derivative work. It's not the original, and it was marketed as the original. And I think that is where the language needs to evolve, to be clear that that is not an original Andy Warhol. And I wonder if just the fact that the Andy Warhol Foundation sanctioned, gave its approval of it, that it then is seen as right, or if actually you have to look at the vision of the artist, right?
Right. So I think this is definitely part of a really interesting greater conversation, because I feel like this is, I mean, it's a pre-existing issue. I feel like it's almost similar to the issues I ran into selling Calders, and every time a collector would say, well, no, but the Calder Foundation said it was okay. And I'd say, well, yes, but the Calder Foundation is still a group of people and they can make mistakes. And occasionally they did actually go back and say, oh, no, I made a mistake with the work. And, you're running a risk, but okay, and sometimes it didn't matter. The collector really wanted a particular Calder mobile, that's what he wanted. And so you let him have what he wants. There are certain types of collectors. I think it's, very clear to us in the art world, there's certain types of collectors who love particular prints by Warhol. It's a certain sign of a certain type of success. And I don't think they're going to care if it's derivative in this digital form or not, because it's not the point for them. And so it's an interesting two worlds sort of colliding a little bit, because there's us in the art world that are a little bit more purist, and we're going to say, well, it has to be quite clear language-wise that this is derivative. And I think there are going to be these sort of NFT style collectors who are really not going to care a difference about whether or not it's derivative or not. And we're going to have to deal with that, So it's a very interesting conversation to be had, that clearly a major auction house is already sort of taking a stance on, which I don't think I was expecting. I wasn't expecting them to that quickly take a stance on it. So I find that interesting to see if maybe museums will respond. I don't know if you feel that museums are in any way influenced by what happens in the sort of major auction market. If that means they're going to feel like, oh, we really even more have to wade into NFTs. If they also have that sort of moment of being in their echo chamber until a Christie's or Sotheby's kind of wakes them up and says, oh, this is a real thing, oh boy. or does it not make any kind of impact on the museum thought?
Yeah, I think the role of brands and trust are so important in this space. And I talk about it also in terms of kind of museums, and when they make NFTs, how important they are as an authenticator or a validator. And it kind of brings back to kind of that social experiment that happened earlier this year with Global Arts Museum, where essentially they kind of took a whole load of open access images from places like the Birmingham collections and Chicago Institute, and tried to sell them on OpenSea. And it's things like, because no one actually wanted to buy them, it's essentially because there was no kind of connection to the museum. The museum had not endorsed them.
Yeah.
I think it's the same way in kind of art markets and Christie's. They have people have so much trust in these kind of institutions.
Yeah.
The same way that we trust the British Museum, we trust the V&A. And I think we can use that trust and kind of exploit it for our own means in the crypto world as well, because at the moment it's a real Wild West. So can we use institutional authority to bring some form of stability to NFTs as well? Could be something that's really interesting. And as you say, I think this is already happening with Christie's, because that's really why museums are starting to take note of it now, because they're like, well, if Christie's are selling them,
right,
what are they? They must be okay. They must have some form of validity. And now it's like next phase. Now, what can museums do to help crypto arts and the kind of dilemmas that they're facing, particularly for crypto artists, who kind of quite often are not even seen as artists by some people, because it's different. It's not the sort of things that we understand.
Yeah, but I wonder if museums are the right. So I think there are two things there. I think if whether museums are the right authenticator to validate crypto art as a medium, versus them as an authenticator to validate kind of the concept of using NFTs and that type of thing and creating some stability. I think that on the crypto art front, it's tough, because if you look at, for example, street art or photography, I don't think museums were the ones helping to create that validity. And I still think they have trouble with street art, for example, and having street art in their collection. And the same with, I think, I would love them to have a role in being a bit of a voice of reason within all of this stuff that's going on. However, the volatility of cryptocurrencies and the inexorable link between cryptocurrency and that volatility and NFTs is going to be a big hurdle for museums to get involved, because I'm seeing it firsthand with the Whitworth, how if you're looking at the volatility of cryptocurrencies and museums holding that type of currency, I think there's a huge issue there. And whenever you look at a solution that tries to solve for that volatility by using fiat currency or anything, you then lose some of that decentralized aspect of it. And then it kind of negates the need for a blockchain. So I think there is still a little bit of a problem there.
How fascinating. So to bring it just a little bit back towards our region, Paris region, since this is CADAF Paris, there's been some interesting conversations around the Louvre recently, because obviously they're going to have the first female ever in its history to start running it, which I think is going to be absolutely fabulous. She's done amazing things already at Musée d'Orsay. And but in that discussion, people have been talking about what do we think a museum like the Louvre should be looking at, because they are a museum that has been quite sort of the forefront of trying to reach new patrons during a pandemic and during the times of COVID-19 through their digital assets, through their Instagram account, which is like quite prolific right now. They were the first to try and entice, you know, the infamous Beyonce Jay-Z music video taking place there. They've had a lot of dancers going through during pandemic when the rest of us couldn't go in there, and it was nice to get a glimpse of the Louvre since we couldn't see it. And so a lot of people have been talking about, you know, what do we see? Do we see that there's a space for an institution like the Louvre to go in where it's not quite what you're saying, where they don't have to delve so deep that they're really just getting smack into the controversy of you know, owning non-fiat currencies and things like this. But is there a way for them to, you know, sort of, as we're kind of talking about a little bit with the museum cup, you know, the image on the cup, is there a way for them to monetize this a bit, use it in a way where they can be interactive with their audience? What do you think, or you can say you have absolutely no thoughts on this about how museums can try to tackle just monetizing?
I wonder if we'll be able to squeeze it all into the time we have left. There's so much they could do.
I know. This is our last question. I gave a biggie for the last question.
One topic we haven't touched on yet, which I think is a very important one, especially for an institution like the Louvre, is the issue of repatriation that a lot of French museums are dealing with at the moment. And actually, this technology might hint towards a future where you can have an acknowledgement of those frames of history that are incorporated in that object and a shared ownership of the metadata, rather than talking just about the physical object, because I think that that is an important thing that we need to talk about.
Oh, that's a fascinating point. I love it. Bernadine, yes, that's really fascinating. I had not even thought about how to apply this to some of like what the Musée Quai Branly is going through, where they are in fact repatriating the physicality of these works to their original countries in Africa. And maybe there's a wonderful way to use NFT to actually bring some of the enjoyment of the work still here, and in a sense of joint ownership. That's a very fascinating point.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. I think the prospect of decolonizing ownership through NFTs is a really interesting space. I think the concept of fractional ownership and how we could use NFTs in the way of kind of, because when you repatriate, it's not just simply returning an object, it's about building a partnership and a relationship with that source community. And can NFTs play a role in that? Particularly, for example, if the physical object is returned, could the NFT become some form of replacement in the physical gallery space? And it kind of then represent that colonial history so that we'll never forget it. You know, kind of recognizing these contentious histories and not just forgetting about them.
And speaking of women in the space who are reputable, that if they're involved, then it's a good idea. There, Anne Bracegirdle in the States is involved with a nonprofit organization that is looking into these issues. So definitely, there will be a lot more conversations around this happening, because it is. I think, Francis, what you said exactly is right. We can't forget what has happened. And if you destroy or just return, you forget all of that really important stuff that the future generations need to acknowledge and never let happen again. And so we need to think about how we can use digital technologies to facilitate those conversations to continue happening.
Wonderful, wonderful. Ladies, I could keep talking to you for hours and hours. Honestly, you guys have such wonderful, interesting points of view. And I think that, I certainly hope that the viewers are going to find it as fascinating as I did. This has just been really, really eye-opening for me. I love it. So hopefully we can do whole other conventions about what museums should be doing where they're paying for consulting in the digital and NFT space. Thank you so very much for joining us, and I can't wait to follow what you're doing, Frances, and to see more. I find that so fascinating. Just kudos to you for this. This is a wonderful area of study. I'm really excited to see what's in your future. And Bernadine, I know Vistara has amazing things, and we did a startup panel where half of them were all talking about how they want to work with you. So I see amazing partnerships in your future as well.
Your fortune telling is really
exactly. I'm just getting into the fortune telling now. So thank you so much, ladies, for joining us, and I hope we're able to see each other all in the real world at some point.
Yeah, but in the meantime, through the metaverse, we can keep our relationship going.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been so insightful. I just love chatting about this, and it's been great to talk with two other women as well. What a treat.
Thanks for having us.
Fabulous. Have a great rest of your day, gals.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.